You are sitting in a university library in Lahore when the world you think you live in ends. It is 2003. You are 24 years old, writing a master's thesis on geopolitical fragmentation in post-Soviet Central Asia, and you have just made an argument about Uzbek energy corridors that your advisor called disturbingly well-reasoned for someone without clearance. You do not know what that means yet. You file it away the way you file away most things, precisely, categorically, without losing it. That quality, the one that lets you remember not just facts, but the structural logic between facts, is the reason a man named Kapoor sits down across from you 3 weeks later in a tea stall in a Narkali bazaar and tells you, without preamble, that your country needs people who think the way you think. He doesn't say which agency. He doesn't show identification. He orders chai for both of you and says, "Your thesis cites a pipeline route that hasn't been publicly disclosed. We need to know where you got that." You tell him. He nods slowly, as if confirming something he already suspected, and then he asks if you have considered what you want to do with the rest of your life. You finish your tea, you say yes. That is how it begins. Not with a dramatic recruitment, not with a test you were told you were taking. It begins with a question about a pipeline and a cup of chai going cold in your hands.
The training takes 14 months, not in one place. You move between facilities the way water moves through different pipes. You arrive, you absorb pressure, you move on. You learn how to read a room before you enter it. You learn how signals intelligence works, how human intelligence is gathered, how the gap between the two is where most catastrophic failures live. You learn that the most dangerous person in any room is not the one with the loudest voice or the most visible power. It is always the one who controls the flow of information, who knows what, when, and at what cost. Your instructors tell you this early. It takes you years to understand they were also describing you. Your first posting is in Islamabad, embedded in an analytical unit that technically reports to 3 different directorates and is, in practice, accountable to none of them clearly. This is not an accident. You spend 2 years watching Afghanistan from across a border that functions less like a line and more like a wound. You track personnel movements, cross-reference signals intercepts with human source reporting, and write assessments that go up the chain in one form and come back down, when they come back at all, in a form that has been edited not for clarity, but for comfort. This bothers you. You begin keeping a private log, not of classified information, but of the delta between what you wrote and what was forwarded. The gap is, from the beginning, significant. By 2007, you are 30 years old, and you understand the first rule of being an intelligence officer. The information is rarely the problem. The problem is always the institutional appetite for the information. An assessment that confirms existing policy moves smoothly. An assessment that contradicts it gets revised, delayed, deprioritized, or quietly buried. You write a report in March of that year concluding that a particular militant network is receiving material support from a source your superiors have categorically told you is an ally. You cite 14 separate corroborating indicators. The report comes back with a note that says the sourcing is insufficient. You know the sourcing is not insufficient. You know the sourcing is inconvenient. These are not the same thing, but inside an institution with a hierarchy and a political ceiling, they are treated as synonymous. You file the report again with 3 additional corroborating sources. This time it does not come back at all. You learn the second rule. Silence from above is not neutrality. Silence is a decision wearing neutral's clothing. You are promoted in 2009, which means you now attend briefings where the stakes are explicit rather than implied. You sit in rooms with generals and diplomats and ministry officials who receive your assessments and then proceed to make decisions that appear to have no relationship to those assessments. You begin to understand that intelligence is not, in practice, the input to decision-making. It is the retrospective justification for decisions already made on the basis of politics, ego, alliance management, and the particular pressures of whoever is in the room. Your job is not to discover the truth. Your job is to produce documents that provide plausible analytical cover for positions that were adopted before you opened your mouth. This is what you have been recruited into. This is what you have been trained for. You did not know this when you sat across from Kapoor in the tea stall. You are not certain he knew it either.
You do your job anyway, because the alternative, quitting, disappearing back into academia, writing papers about pipelines for an audience of 12, feels like a form of cowardice you are not yet ready to name. and because occasionally your work matters in a direct and verifiable way. A network disrupted, a transfer of materiel intercepted, a diplomat warned in time. The wins are small and specific, and they do not make the national news, but you know about them, and knowing is enough, for a while. The crisis that changes the architecture of your career happens in 2011. You receive intelligence, raw, unprocessed, from a source embedded deep enough that his reports arrive with a handling protocol that involves 3 separate encryption layers, indicating that a planned counterterrorism operation is operating on a fundamentally false premise about its target's location. The operation is 48 hours for the execution. You write the assessment, you flag it urgent, you take the unusual step of requesting a direct meeting with a senior official rather than routing the assessment through the standard chain. The official's aide tells you the official is unavailable. You request the deputy. The deputy's assistant takes your number. No one calls. You escalate through every available channel inside a 46-hour window. The operation proceeds on schedule. The target is not where the operational premise assumed. 3 people die who were not the intended target. The actual target is unharmed and gone within 12 hours. You sit in your office at 2 in the morning reading the after-action traffic, and you feel, for the first time, the particular weight of knowledge that could not be delivered, not because the system lacked the information, but because the system lacked the structural will to receive it. You do not tell anyone what you know about the 46 hours before that operation. You cannot. You do not have the forum, the protection, or the authority. What you have is the knowledge, and the knowledge sits in you like something load-bearing. That is the 3rd rule, and it is the one they never teach you in training. Knowing is not the same as being able to act on what you know. The gap between those 2 things is where intelligence officers either find a way to function or quietly collapse. You find a way to function. It costs you something every year. By 2014, you have developed what your colleagues call an uncanny analytical track record, meaning that your assessments are right more often than is comfortable for the people whose decisions they contradict. This makes you both valuable and inconvenient, a combination that places you in a specific kind of institutional limbo where you are consulted frequently and promoted rarely. You are the person who gets called when the official assessment has failed and someone needs to know what actually happened. You are not the person who is in the room when the official policy is being shaped. You understand this trade-off and accept it, because the alternative is to compromise the quality of your analysis in order to make it more palatable. And you have watched what happens to the officers who do that. They rise faster. They are wrong more often. When they are wrong, the consequences fall on people whose names do not appear in any briefing document. The year 2016 brings you a source you will refer to in your internal logs only as Meridian. Meridian is positioned through a sequence of circumstances that took 4 years of careful cultivation to engineer inside a financial network that moves money across 3 jurisdictions for purposes that are officially commercial and actually entirely otherwise. What Meridian tells you over 18 months rewrites your understanding of several relationships your government has treated as foundational. The corroboration is extraordinary. The implications are structural, meaning that acting on the intelligence does not mean disrupting an operation. It means acknowledging that certain institutional relationships were built on false premises and must be dismantled. That is not an intelligence problem. That is a political problem wearing intelligence clothing, and political problems, you have learned, do not get solved by analysis. They get managed, meaning deferred, absorbed, and eventually normalized until the cost of managing them exceeds the cost of confrontation, which in your experience has not yet happened within your institutional lifetime. You write the Meridian assessments anyway, all 18 months of them. Meticulous, sourced, structured with the care of someone who knows the documents may outlast the politics that currently make them unactionable. You keep copies, not because you plan to leak them, you do not,
but because you understand at this point in your career that institutional memory is selective in ways that are convenient for the institution and catastrophic for the historical record. If the meridian intelligence is ever needed, it will be found. If it is never needed, the copies are simply weight you carry. You carry a great deal of weight by now. You are 37 years old. You have been inside this system for 13 years. You have written assessments that were right and were ignored and were later vindicated by events that cost lives. You have written assessments that were right and were acted on and prevented things that will never make any record because prevented things leave no visible trace. You do not know the ratio. You suspect the prevented things column is longer than you give it credit for because despair is easier to measure than absence. But you hold the suspicion lightly, because certainty in either direction is a luxury the evidence does not support. What you know, the accumulated, layered, cross-reference knowledge that lives in you after 13 years of analytical work, is no longer an asset in the simple sense. It is a condition. You cannot unknow the architecture of the networks you have mapped. You cannot unknow the names that appear in the meridian reporting. You cannot unknow the delta between the official record and the 46 hours before the 2011 operation. Knowledge above a certain density and at a certain level of sensitivity stops being information and becomes something more like exposure. You are not merely a person who knows things. You are a person whose knowing constitutes a risk to others and who is therefore managed, kept close enough to be useful, never elevated high enough to have independent authority, and watched in ways that are never acknowledged but are always present. You noticed the surveillance on yourself 2 years ago. Not crude surveillance, not the obvious kind you were trained to detect, the subtle kind. Access logs pulled on your analytical database queries more frequently than standard audit cycles would require. A travel authorization that took 3 times longer than normal to process. A colleague you trust, slightly too casually, asking about your weekend plans with slightly too much frequency. These are not definitive, they're indicators. You treat them the way you treat all indicators. You note them, you weight them, you continue to function while adjusting your operational posture in small, deniable ways. You do not tell anyone about the surveillance. You do not raise a formal concern. You understand that raising a formal concern about surveillance by your own institution would require trusting the institution's internal mechanisms, and your 13 years of observational data on those mechanisms do not support that trust. What you do instead is the thing you have always done. You analyze the situation with the same rigor you applied to external threats, and you identify your options, and you choose the one with the best risk-adjusted outcome. For now, that option is to continue, to be useful, to write accurate assessments, and to ensure that the Meridian files are in a location that does not depend on institutional goodwill for their preservation. Today is a Tuesday in late autumn. You're sitting in a briefing room that smells like recycled air and institutional carpet, and across from you are 4 people who need your analysis of a situation that has been developing for 8 months. You have the analysis. It is thorough and it is accurate, and it is going to create a problem for at least 2 of the 4 people in this room because it contradicts a position they have been publicly committed to for the better part of a year. You know this. They do not yet know that you know this. You watch them settle into their chairs, arrange their papers, prepare to receive information on the assumption that the information will confirm their existing orientation. You have been in this room, metaphorically, dozens of times. You know exactly what is about to happen. You open the folder. You begin to speak.